mentioned that I'm from Chatham House, which is formerly known as the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and we address largely policy issues. So I think my talk is very different from many of the others today. It's not academic, I'm talking more about policy across the European Union. It's much shorter, you'll be very pleased to hear. I realised that I was fifth in the morning, and people want to finish at 1, so it's not a vast number of slides. The other thing to mention is that I work part-time at Chatham House, and I do other independent work, and I work on a report called the World Nuclear Industry Status Report that I've been doing with a colleague of mine, Michael Snyder, for actually over 20 years. We've been publishing this, and it's worldnuclearreport.org if you're interested, and it's now an annual update of how we perceive the nuclear industry. So what I was going to do was just talk through the situation in the EU and how the reaction is quite different from what we've heard in terms of the presentations to the impact on the UK of Fukushima. So first, a bit of background for those that are not from this part of the world. Just in terms of EU energy consumption divided by source. So we can see obviously the largest there is petroleum, 35%, gas 25%, and coal 17%. So very heavy dependence on fossil fuels, slightly less than the global average, which is around 88%. And that is because we have a higher dependence on nuclear than the global average. So 14% of energy comes from nuclear power. How that then divides across the EU, and this is looking at electricity, not energy. So it's around a third of the EU's electricity comes from nuclear. And the boxes are the share of electricity in the different member states. So not all member states produce or have nuclear power plants, but the majority do. There's 2 countries that have closed their nuclear operations. So Lithuania and Italy did have nuclear power and now closed. And as you can see here, a large variation in terms of percentage use. So France, very well known, large numbers of reactors, and has around 70-75% of its electricity coming from nuclear. And then you have a few others, Belgium, Slovakia, Sweden, and Slovenia, that have around 40%. So a number that are really quite dependent on the technology for their electricity sources. What's quite interesting there is the dominance of France. So France both has very heavy use of nuclear power within the percentage of its power sector, but also is a large country, so therefore it dominates the EU. So around 50% of the Union's nuclear electricity is generated in one country. What's also quite surprising, I think, about this is Germany is the second largest contributor. So even after the changes in Germany, it's still the second largest user of nuclear within the EU. So you then see other countries, Spain, Sweden, UK, as being dominant, with most of the other countries having 1 or 2 stations in operation. And then briefly, the history. So this just goes back over time, since the beginning of nuclear in the EU, and shows both the startup in terms of megawatts, and then the closure of units, and then the black line is the average. It's quite interesting, what we see at the beginning is the very small units, so they don't register very much. So some of the Magnoxes in the UK, 50 megawatts. We're comparing that with the 1.6 gigawatts that we're now talking about building. You can see how things have progressed over the last 50 years. And you then see that peak in the mid-80s, where large numbers of reactors being pulled online, and then you have Chernobyl. So that's where you start seeing this real collapse in some ways of orders since then, and then you had sort of largely completion projects of those who were ordered before Chernobyl, and some in Central Europe that were less affected. So, and then over the last decade you've basically seen a decrease in the contribution, or not the contribution, the number of power plants and the capacity of nuclear, and then you see in 2011 and 12 the significant decrease, which is the Fukushima reactors coming off in Germany. So clear trends that are affected by nuclear accidents and incidents within the EU. I think this is just a bit of history to show how there have been phase-out initiatives of different types across the EU over time. So you had national referendums in Austria in 1978, which led to the abandonment of a nuclear power plant, Sventendorf. It was very, very close. I think it was 50.5% versus 49.5% in terms of not starting up a completed unit. You've had the Swedish case in 1980 that said we'd cap construction operation for 25 years of the reactors. It still saw a number completed, and as we've seen, actually, this has been overturned, and they're now continuing to operate nuclear power beyond that time, although a couple of reactors were closed. And then you had another national referendum in Italy in 1987, which was directly as a result of Chernobyl. There were 4 units in operation, others were being under construction, and that referendum was enforced, and Italy, as I mentioned before, is no longer has nuclear power in its country. And then there's been a number of parliamentary-led or government-led phase-out initiatives. Belgium in 1999, Germany, which we'll come on to, the Netherlands and Spain. So again, we'll talk more about that, but I just wanted to put these up as interesting countries to remember in terms of their reaction post-Fukushima. So this is my sort of categorization of what's happened across different countries as a result of Fukushima, and we'll go into a bit more detail on these countries as I go forward, but just to sort of touch upon them now. Firstly, countries in which you've seen a phase-out plans reintroduced or reconfirmed. So Belgium, Germany, Italy, and I mentioned they've all had those in the past. Nuclear power remains a non-option, so countries that don't have nuclear power and haven't changed their position and are not going to build nuclear power as a result of Fukushima. You see a reduced role for nuclear going forward. So France is a very clear case. And I put Switzerland in brackets because it's not formally part of the EU, but it had a government decision against the construction of more nuclear. Continuing with existing programs, I put Sweden, Spain, Slovenia and Netherlands, and then another group which we'll touch upon at the end who have continued their plans regardless in terms of looking to build more nuclear power plants. But then the final column at the end is firm orders since Fukushima, so we haven't seen any actual construction starting as a result over the last 2.5 years. So just to go through in a little more detail, Belgium, as with countries that have had significant changes. So Belgium, in October 2011, went back to a previous agreement, and I think this is one of the key issues that we've seen in the case of Belgium and Italy. The government has reenacted past decisions, or it's not the government, but previous decisions have been reenacted. So in the case of Belgium, it went back to a legislation of 2003 as a result of Fukushima. In France, I think is underreported. What the President Hollande said was that they would reduce nuclear electricity mix from 75 to 50% by 2025, which is a significant decrease. 25% decrease is roughly the same decrease as you see in Germany from what it was to zero. So it's a major shift in political momentum. It involves the shutting down of a number of units in 2016 in this term of office. There's also a new energy consultation underway in order to meet these objectives, but I think we're yet to see exactly how that is intended to unfold, because it really is a significant shift from previous very pro-nuclear. I think you would argue he's not anti-nuclear, but it's a significant shift in terms of previous government positions. And so Germany, which I think is the most clear example of a political impact of Fukushima. This was Angela Merkel's statement to the Bundestag in March of 2011. And it's one of these very interesting examples. In some ways, which side of the nuclear divide are you on this question? Some people look at Merkel's statement as this is just classic politics. She could see an election coming up, she could see the Greens were rising up, therefore all she was doing was electioneering because she didn't want to lose this key land estate. Other people say that she was a nuclear engineer, she understood the situation, she spent the weekend watching the television and was totally affected by it on a very personal level and came up with this statement. So nobody here was in the room can verify it, but it resulted in a very clear change in direction from the German government. But just to give a little history, because as I mentioned, it's not the first time that nuclear power has been a key political issue within the country. So in 2002, we had an SPD Green coalition in the country, and they had a nuclear phase-out agreement which said that they would basically limit the operating life of the reactors for 32 years, and there'd be no more construction of new nuclear, and there'd be no reprocessing. Then in 2009, you had a CDU Liberal government coalition that overturned this and said that they would extend the operating life for 40 years, but there would be significant economic consequences for the industry. They would have to pay money into a fund in order to continue the operating life. And so this was just entering into force, or just entered into force, just prior to Fukushima, so in September 2010. So we then had the events in Japan, and then 4 days later, after that, so the sort of 15th of March, the government suspended the operation of the 8 oldest reactors in Germany, and said that they were going to launch an ethics committee that was to look at the implications for the German government. This concluded in May of that year, in which it said the phase-out is necessary and is recommended in order to rule out the risks posed by nuclear power in Germany in the future. A phase-out is possible because of lower risk alternatives are available. When that was released, then the government confirmed its decision in terms of to move away from nuclear power, and a cross-party agreement was reached. I think that's a very important point in terms of the stability of this agreement, because as we've seen before, the CDU was a pro-nuclear government, a pro-nuclear party, and it has introduced legislation to phase out nuclear power. So you have the SPD and the Greens are anti-nuclear, and so you have a large swathe of the political parties basically signing up to this agreement, which gives it a bit more stability than we've had in the past in terms of nuclear positioning in Germany. So it said that we would close reactors, or 8 were immediately closed, and then you would then see the closure of others through until 2022, which is 2 more terms of office from now. So there's German elections this weekend. We're assuming that Angela Merkel will get re-elected in either form of grand coalition or potentially a coalition with the Greens and the Liberals. I don't know, we'll see. But that will take us through until 2017. So there'll be largely 1 more term of office while this is effectively done. So it's quite interesting in terms of how stable this may or may not be. So in total, 27 reactors have been closed in Germany to date, and you'll see that the remaining, as I said, closure through until 2022. So what is the sort of the revised energy plan? So renewable power should go up from around 17% at the time to around 35% by 2020, at least 35%. This is of power. That's roughly in line with the existing commitments that Germany had under the EU directive. So from a renewables perspective, probably the key word was at least. Prior to that, they were expecting to reach around that total by 2020. As we mentioned, the reactors to remain closed. The climate targets remain in place, so around 40% of reduction by 2020 and 80 to 95% by 2050. Energy consumption to halve by 2050. And that includes electricity to decrease by 10% by 2020. So really, really stringent and far-reaching energy-saving targets that are put in place. And I think this is an absolutely crucial point, is Germany's been very successful in deploying renewables over the last decade, but its energy efficiency has lagged behind in terms of a sustainability perspective. And then construction of higher fossil fuel plants and coal plants was envisaged. I mean, we can't go too much detail about how successful it has been, but just a few bullet points of what I think the arguments are on both sides around this. I think those against the energy plan say what it's leading to is higher energy prices, which is making Germany inefficient and uncompetitive. It's leading to higher emissions. We've had to close down nuclear power stations, and some of those have been replaced by coal. And there has been insufficient EU consultation. This was a big point in Brussels, because they said, you just turned up and said you're closing your reactors. What about the common European energy project? Those in favour of it, it has mobilised a major engagement on energy, an important issue. There was widespread discussion on this. The term vendor, the energy vendor, was only used once before, which was following the collapse of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It is a movement. It is more than just a switch or a change. It is designed to be a sort of a transformation, and it has societal connotation. So it has engaged people within the energy sector on both sides, for or against, but also the public and the politicians. So I think people would argue that it's what is needed if we're going to transform the energy sector for climate change reasons. You need that level of engagement. It's put Germany, I think, in the lead in terms of the electricity sector. We've seen Germany leading in terms of PV. It's installed, it has around 30 gigawatts of installed photovoltaics. And what we're seeing is problems associated with that, so Germany now has addressed in terms of storage, smart grids, etc. And that is part of that process. So saying I wouldn't talk, and I'm going on a bit. Italy, we've mentioned. Weather references, I think this just backs up what was said before, was it Kepping? In terms of the relative changes in terms of the relative reports to Fukushima across different countries. And it's quite interesting, if we see here those countries that have had, in some ways you could cross-reference this with those that have had political changes on nuclear in the recent past. We've had France, Germany, Austria, which is strongly anti-nuclear as a country, Belgium, Italy, all had quite heavy or quite large degrees of both media coverage and political debate, and in many of these cases changes in energy policy. The exception of Spain, which I don't know very much about, but it just strikes me maybe that they were more interested in the recession. But anyway, interesting to try and map these two areas. So, in terms of that list of countries, I also had a list of those that intended to carry on building nuclear. And so, again, just quickly run down these. So Bulgaria wants to finish or build 2 reactors at Kozloduy. It's not quite sure the details of that. In the Czech Republic, Temelin 3 and 4 are proposed, with contracts supposed to be agreed this year. That has now been put back at some time. There's been ongoing, let's say, negotiations between the various bidding parties and the government. Hungary wanting to call tenders, invitations to tender this year. I think that's quite unlikely now for PACs 5 and 6. Lithuania, which closed down its reactors, is now trying to build a regional reactor, and Hitachi seems to be quite interested in that. But 2015 is now the earliest date in which construction will start. Poland seems to be moving backwards and forwards whether or not they'll build nuclear. I think they moved against it in the last few months. Romania has Canadian-designed reactors, 2 in operation, and they're talking about completing a 3rd. They're having problems raising the finance. And then the UK is probably the most advanced of all of these countries on this list in terms of proposals for new build. And as I think many of you know, there's an ongoing negotiation between EDF, the utility, and the government over the strike price and the contracts for difference in terms of what guaranteed price the utility can get from the government in order to finance it, or in order to be able to raise the finance. And the negotiations are ongoing. We expected by now that an agreement would have been reached, and it hasn't been, so maybe people might know more in terms of when that might be coming forward. On the European level, just to finish up, I think some of the key elements that have come out of that is in March 2011, the European Council called for a stress test which looked at the safety of all EU nuclear plants should be reviewed on the basis of comprehensive and transparent risks and safety assessment. This led to a communication published in 2012 that was, it said no major accidents have ever taken place at operating power plants in the EU. It's interesting in terms of what it defines major accidents, because of course the EU has had accidents. And it then gave figures in terms of what it estimated that there was a number of measures that needed to be put in place to improve the safety in the power plants. And this would range between 300 million and 200 million plants per unit, euros per unit, over the 132 operating power plants or reactors within the European Union. So they basically said there's a number of measures that need to be put in place. It has a large possible cost implications, but overall they're not huge compared to the revenues that the power plants can generate. In the UK, the main criticism they had is there's no satisfactory evidence of capability of plants beyond the design-based accident for flooding. And the most significant, I think, element that they identified within the whole sort of safety assessment was for two Finnish reactors, these boiling water reactors, and they said that the time for restoration of safety functions is, in the case of loss of all electric power and of ultimate heat sinks, is less than 1 hour. So some of the problems that were identified in terms of the Fukushima design, as I said, they're both boiling water reactors. They identified a similar problem in terms of lack of backup. So the Commission intends to report on the implementation of these conclusions in 2014 next year. And then the other sort of direct element of the review that took place was a look at third-party insurance. So the liability, the EU has a quite complicated and non-uniform approach to nuclear liability across the EU. And so, just finally, three areas that I think are important that will affect nuclear development going forward, some of which are related to Fukushima and others not. The first is the revision of the EU state aid rules. In order to build nuclear, as we're seeing in the UK, utilities require some sort of guarantee on electricity price, or likes to require guarantee on electricity price. This will have to be approved by Brussels, and it is part of an ongoing review of defining state aid rules. Currently, renewables are exempt from it from environmental protection reasons, and there is a proposal that this might be extended to other low-carbon options, i.e. nuclear. But as we've seen, there's a wide variety of views within the EU on nuclear power, so whether or not this will be adopted, we have to see the intentions for it to be adopted in 2014. The other key issue is shale gas. What we've seen in the United States is the impact of shale gas on coal. Coal is not being used as much as why the EU is importing it more, which is increasing our emissions. But it's also impacting upon nuclear power. So a number of power plants in the US have been closed this year. Uncertainty around the development of shale gas within the EU, I think raises questions for nuclear builders. If you consider that you're betting on the price of gas over the next 60 years, then shale gas is an important consideration within that. And then finally, EU energy efficiency and renewables. What we're seeing in Germany is the impact of higher renewables on the grid is affecting the market price, affecting the need for balancing, and so how that mixes with nuclear baseload capacity is an important consideration, and whether or not the EU adopts a 2030 renewables target, I think has an impact on nuclear power. And so, just finally, in terms of the projections going forward, this is EU energy production. So since 2000, and in the sort of the solid lines are what's happened to date. So you see that nuclear is the largest domestic energy source. If you say that nuclear is domestic, uranium is imported, but is deemed as domestic. So you can see how much energy is coming from nuclear. You can see the decline in solid fuels, the decline in gas, the decline in petroleum products, and then the increase in renewables. And if these current projections carry on, and they're expected to under the Renewable Energy Directive, then by the end of this decade, renewables will overtake nuclear in terms of the overall contribution to Europe's energy production, and that is happening across different member states, and that is an important development in terms of the psychology of dependency of nuclear versus renewables. And so just to conclude, I think that there is a significant uncertainty over the future of the electricity sector in Europe. As I mentioned, shale gas, renewables, nuclear. I haven't touched upon coal, which we're seeing a large amount of coal closed, or expected to be closed in the next decade. Whether or not that happens, we have to see. I would argue that new nuclear won't happen without some sort of state support, and that is uncertain within the current political mix of the EU. And then I guess finally, it's unlikely that there will be a unified EU policy on nuclear in the coming years, and there is significant difference in terms of public policy and political support. So thank you very much.